More law, how's it? Hello, very good day to you, South Africa. Welcome to this very special News 24 webinar convened now to discuss the delayed Madlanga Commission of Inquiry into policing and the criminal justice system in this country as we know it today. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be introducing our expert panel in the next short while. My name's Graham Robenheimer. I'm the host of News 24's The Lead. It's our daily definitive audio and video podcast, and I'll be your moderator for this very critical discussion today. First, however, on behalf of the News 24 family and our cast of thousands, we'd like to take a very few moments now to remember the late, great broadcaster, political journalist, and associate editor, Tsidi Madia. Thank you, Danko, Nkosi, and Ngiyabonga for your country duty, mentoring many young journalists over the years. You will be sorely missed, ma'am, by many in newsrooms and across Mzansi far and wide. Sincere condolences to all who knew and loved this powerhouse journalist of note. She did not suffer fools lightly. We'll pause here for a brief moment now to honor Tsidi's memory. Danko Tsidi, may you rest in peace. Thank you. On to our topic of today's discussion. Well, it was all meant to get underway in Pretoria, the capital, in the new week. Even me, I was getting a flight ticket ready. But the Madlanga inquiry's since been delayed, seemingly due to factors that's out of its control. Well, the Commission's media team this week revealed that the reasons for this delay in commencing public hearings this coming Monday lie squarely with the Justice Ministry. Well, we've since heard from Minister Mameloko Kubai that she suspended her department's Director General, Advocate Doc Mashabane, as well as his deputy, Jabu Hlatswayo, for failing to ensure that the Commission had adequate information and communication technology, that's ICT for short, infrastructure set up in time. We've since heard from the President's spokesperson, by the way, who's insisting that Cyril Ramaphosa is quote-unquote frustrated by the time that's already been lost here. Well, this inquiry, chaired by the now retired acting Deputy Chief Justice Mbuyiseli Madlanga, well, has already indicated that it's been in contact with one of its chief witnesses, no doubt, KwaZulu-Natal Police Commissioner Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, about testifying, although it doesn't necessarily mean that Mkhwanazi will be the first witness either. The KZN top cops, of course, publicly alleged that the heart of the SA Police Service has been captured by politically connected criminal figures, chiefly of which Vusi Musi Kat Matlala, whose dodgy 360 million rand SAPS's health services tender has since been cancelled. Still, he's languishing in a Pretoria cell at this very minute for a failed hit on his former lover, actress Tebogo Tobojani. Now, joining us on this expert panel today to discuss the Madlanga inquiry, its aims, challenges, is our star specialist legal journalist, Karyn Maughan, political analyst, media columnist, and fellow author, Mpumelelo Mkhabela, as well as renowned criminologist and political scientist, currently based at Stellenbosch University, Dr. Guy Lamb. Thank you, all of you, for your time today. I really do appreciate it. Let's dive straight into it. Karyn, I thought let's start with you, if we may. Any update? You've been following very closely all the media briefings and statements in regards to, the protocol and logistics around this much anticipated commission. Where do we sit today?
Well, essentially, the key question is whether this IT capability, this essential requirement for this commission to have a very safe and secure IT network through which it can obtain potentially highly sensitive documentation, potentially classified documentation, which addresses the kind of issues raised by Lieutenant General Mkhwanazi, as well as this invitation from this commission for members of the public to bring in their alleged, evidence of malfeasance of the entire law enforcement, justice, intelligence, metro police, because this is a very far-ranging inquiry. Whether that, the inquiry will only proceed when that infrastructure is set up. And I understand from, people within that environment that there was a great deal of frustration because up until very recently, the evidence leaders, investigators, commission staff actually, had been waiting for those laptops for quite some time. And that seems to be at the heart of why Mr. Hlatswayo, of course, is the DDG of ITC, was, now facing suspension or has been suspended. So it's really about the minister said in her statement earlier this week that, the laptops have been obtained, Graham, but the installation of that software hasn't happened. And in fact, my understanding from her statement was that the tender had gone out for that security system, but that doesn't mean that tender's been finalized. And then it becomes a question of how long does it take to put that security system in place and then to test it, because you're dealing with highly sensitive stuff. And I'm going to come back to this, but one of the terms of reference for this commission says that it effectively states that it is solely responsible for the protection of witnesses or potential witnesses. So it has a legal obligation to make sure that no one who gives information to it is in any way compromised or their data is obtained in a malfeasant way. So that's security issue around the data is pivotal, and it's only once that has been resolved and finalized, and the commission itself is happy with it, that we have any hope of this inquiry proceeding.
Right, and obviously, Karyn, at this point, we're now, staring down, eating into time where, the first sort of interim report should have been, crafted, if you will, and the president's now come out through his spokesperson, Vincent Maughan, saying, he's frustrated or whatever, but it's not as if we haven't seen parts of this movie before, right? These ICT delays, we've seen in the past how the Justice Ministry seemingly, allegedly blocked the NPA from accessing archive findings from the Zondo Commission. So we shouldn't be surprised, right?
I mean, there is this very unfortunate history to this. And it's always this thing of never impute to malice that which can be explained by incompetence. But I think there's an increasing frustration of the public because there is such a thing as malicious incompetence. And sometimes, it's not overt interference. It's the kind of death by 1,000 paper cuts, bureaucratic hurdles that are put in, when an environment, there's just obstruction continuously. And that was the story of the state capture inquiry as well. I mean, I personally wrote for News 24 about how, investigators in Zondo weren't paid for 6 months. And at that stage, there was a lot of to and froing and antagonism, seeming antagonism between that inquiry and the Justice Department. So one would hope that we aren't seeing a repeat of that movie. And I think Minister Kubayo is very sensitive about this, particularly in an environment, Graham, where the allegation effectively is that the entire law enforcement environment is being suited or tailored to protect criminal elements. And in that kind of sea of morass of allegation and suspicion and a fundamental chipping away at already very beleaguered public trust in government, delays like this are only going to further the perception that government is not serious about addressing these allegations and doing something about them.
100%, Karyn. We're going to come back to you in the next short while. Let's bring in one of our expert panelists here, Mpumelelo Mkhabela, an author, media economist, political analyst, journalist. Mpumelelo, thanks so much for joining us on this discussion. I thought let's start with the zinger off the bat, if you will. There's been this sort of opinion being bandied about, and please, you're welcome to respond to what Karyn's also said, about revelations that may emanate from the Madlanga Commission, which some are already viewing as a greater extension of the Zondo Commission, that these revelations may prove to be a considerable death knell for the ANC. What's your view?
Well, it's difficult to say what the implications will be of what will come out of the commission, because we just don't know what in fact will emerge. We have an idea based on recent revelations and recent reporting by us, the media, of the corruption or alleged corruption and irregularities in tenders, in subs. We also have an idea based on General Mkhwana's allegation of what might come out of that. But as to the political implications, we don't know the gravity. It depends on the findings, and it depends on the nature of the findings and what Madlanga will recommend should happen in the end. But let me say the link to the politics here, interestingly, is that after Senzo Mchunu, the I don't know whether we should call him police minister or former police minister, because that's another dilemma. But anyway, after Senzo Mchunu, the suspended or on leave police minister was put on leave by the president. He made a speech in one of ANC meetings in KwaZulu-Natal, and he was speaking in isiZulu. And in that meeting, he said something to the effect that, you know, the ANC, since it took over power, it appointed certain people in high positions, and some of these people are black people in senior positions. They've the privilege now of occupying positions as higher up as being the general in SAPS. And then he says something to the effect that now some of these people, they appear not to respect those positions and not to appreciate that the ANC put them there. So he, in my view, was the first person to draw a direct political link with at least the allegations made by General Mkhwanazi. There was no doubt he was referring to Mkhwanazi, and there was no doubt that he believes that what Commissioner General Mkhwanazi has said is damaging to him. But he seems to suggest that General Mkhwanazi doesn't appreciate the political environment that gave rise to him rising to the position to where he is. So he should rather be grateful. That's my interpretation of what he said. So what that means is basically that a lot of people like Mchunu, if the allegations that come out in this Madlanga commission are tested, some of them at least, and are proven to be damaging, they understand that the damage will come back to the ANC. The extent of that damage, we don't know. But he already, by saying what he said now, you could see that he feels that, you know, this is damaging to him and it's damaging to his party, Mchunu, and he seems to blame Mkhwanazi for that, without saying or without proving yet whether Mkhwanazi is wrong or right. And of course, that's the Madlanga Commission's task to prove whether there's any wrong or right or in all of these allegations.
And of course, yeah, you have two very senior top cops, Fani Masemola as well as Shadrach Sibiya, you know, duking it out in court. Who thought that we'd ever see this happening? While I have you on the topic that Karyn sort of touched on, are you surprised that we're sitting, you know, with these delays in terms of logistics for the commission itself? You would have think, given South Africa's rich history of establishing commissions of inquiry, we would have got things done a lot quicker.
To be honest, it's astonishing that with, you know, we have a thriving industry of commissions of inquiry. I mean, as we speak, there's one that's sitting now on the TRC, chaired by Justice Kapempe. And in the last 2 years, this is in fact, I think the third commission that she is chairing. It was the Stellenbosch one, and then there was, she was in the Usindiso building collapse and people died there. She chaired that inquiry, and now she's chairing the TRC inquiry. In fact, commissions of inquiries are often named after the presiding chairperson. So you would have the Madlanga Commission or the Kapempe Commission. Now, if you refer to Kapempe Commission, I wouldn't know which one you're referring to. That's the extent to which we have had so many of these commissions of inquiry. So we had a commission of inquiry looking at the structure of university fees, for example, chaired by Judge Jonathan Heger, who had retired. And we had, there's so many of this. So out of that, it appears as if we have not had the requisite experience, and there is no institutional memory or expertise that can be deployed to improve on the previous inquiry and how it was held, and to even be innovative around it, because it is now clear that commissions of inquiries are part of the way this country is governed. So if that is the case, you would expect the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development or other supporting departments to have the requisite expertise in terms of personnel, in terms of the structures, in terms of facilities, in terms of the processes, and the technical know-how to do these things as quickly as possible. It's astonishing that, notwithstanding all of that, we're having this type of delays. But there's another element to this, what I would say, incompetence. Whenever there has to be procurement in government, there's always politics behind that procurement. Who gets the tender to do what? And how much is that tender? and who are the beneficiaries of that tender. Whether the tender is wrongly awarded or correctly awarded, there will always be question marks around it because there's so much suspicion around government procurement. And the reasons are understandable. If you look at the Auditor General's report, you'll find them. A bulk of what's going wrong in the country has got to do with procurement. So the moment we couldn't have this commission of inquiry on time, precisely because certain IT equipment had not been procured on time, or some services have not been procured on time, it immediately raises suspicion that there must be something wrong with the tender process. And it might emerge later that perhaps it was not complied with and that type of thing. So for me, the incompetence is really astonishing.
Right. If you're just tuning in, you're, of course, with News 24 and the Cast of Thousands, discussing the now delayed Madlanga Commission of Inquiry. Our panels, of course, legal journalist Karyn, as well as fellow journalist, political analyst Mpumelelo Mkhabela. Now we turn to criminologist and political scientist Dr. Guy Lamb, based out of Stellenbosch University. Doc, absolute pleasure to have you on here. Watching all the revelations, everything about Vusi Musi, Kat Matlala, seeing Mkhwanazi come out at that massive press conference, really bombshell stuff, wearing sort of almost military fatigues, just the general sort of visuals of that coming out, putting out everything as we understand it now, and the establishment of this commission. It must be fascinating of a doctor of your caliber to watch.
It is fascinating, but it's also deja vu, because this is not the first time these allegations have been made. There's actually a long history of these kind of problems affecting the police. I mean, it even goes back before 1994. But if we look, for example, what happened with Jackie Celebi and his relationship with Ben Agliotti, the Finnish and Clark comments, well known, notorious around that. Then we go through a few more years, and then we hit the period when we had Beckett Cele as the National Police Commissioner, and the what led to his suspension was a supply chain issue around property rentals, and his kind of relationship with a kind of businessman within Pretoria led to his suspension. Then of course we had the Homotso Falalane case, also around supply chain management, procurement, kind of corrupt relationships. You've got major former police person who has these companies, these IT companies, that's has the inside track and understanding, and taking senior policemen who are decision makers on overseas trips to go to football clubs, for example. So what Lieutenant General Mkhwanazi has kind of exposed really is a further example of this kind of history of problems with the SAPs. But I mean, it certainly wasn't the first time he did it. There was a sort of infamous, interesting meeting that happened in Parliament around the 5th of March, where Mkhwanazi speaks for 30 minutes. The minister was there, the National Police Commissioner was there, General Sabia was there, was chaired, the full parliamentary committee was there. It was close to a 5-hour meeting. And Mkhwanazi makes these allegations. The minister is there. He sort of fobs them off. The parliamentary portfolio committee doesn't know what to do with them. And they sort of make this vague comment at the end, oh, we'll do something about this, and then nothing happens, and then months go by, and then we have this kind of infamous press conference that happens. So I mean, it is important that that it's been prioritized, because what's happened in the past is there have been commissions of inquiry that have looked at elements of the police. So if we sort of look at going back to the 2021 unrest, that looked at crime intelligence, particularly around the unrest that happened in KZN. Then, of course, we had the Farlam Marikana Commission of Inquiry, which looked particularly at police militarization and public order policing. We have had Zondo that looked at crime intelligence and some corruption, but we haven't had a commission that's really looked at the problems around corruption within the police, looking at political influence in terms of the police. And so this is an issue, and we tend to forget our history. I mean, going back to 2018, for example, Robert McBride, when he was head of IPID, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, which is sort of the police watchdog, he made this comment in 2018 that was around that SAPS had been captured by a matrix of corruption, was governed by a matrix of corruption. And he said this was the greatest threat to South Africa's national security. So, those issues haven't really gone away. So I think it's really important that we are having this commission, and that there's going to be evidence and we can really unpick it. But also we've had this history of kind of political meddling within the police, which has really undermined its neutrality and independence. So, the police have been pulled into ANC elective conferences. You've had sort of money in the police being used to acquire the kind of the grabbers, the kind of, you know, those machines and equipment that can intercept cell phone communications, and that being used in relation to influencing outcomes within ANC conferences. So, you know, it's been a long time coming, and it's, you know, almost a blessing in disguise that these allegations have been made. Particularly also, we've had problems around, you know, you've got the National Anti-Corruption Council, which has been chaired by the acting minister, Feroz Kachalia. You know, one of the issues they had, for example, is they couldn't get the police to come and brief them properly on issues around how they internally deal with corruption and discipline. The SAPs just didn't cooperate. And so, you know, we now got to the point where now there's going to have to be conversations, and there has to be testimony around these issues.
Right. And I wonder if, you know, the Khayelitsha Commission of Inquiry, stretching back all the way, you know, to 2012, could offer somewhat of a blueprint, if you will, taking, you know, this particular commission a little bit forward and already establishing certain areas that it needs to look at. And I do want to get into that discussion with you down the line, Doc. But very quickly, your take on these delays. Something a bit more sinister at play here. We've already seen, you know, two pretty senior officials, you know, shown the door, at least for now, notices of suspension. Your take?
It's very difficult to say if it's sinister. I mean, having worked with government, and government procurement processes are particularly clunky and difficult. And in order to make them work, it really takes, it's about, you know, sort of forceful management to, you know, kind of push the issues, make sure the committees are meeting on the right time, that deadlines are adhered to. So it seems as though it was just the balls got dropped. Maybe there was some intention to try and delay it, to embarrass, but I think ultimately this came down to it wasn't prioritized, and whoever was managing the process, you know, it hasn't managed it properly, and as a result, we have this outcome of the equipment not being ready on time.
Mm-hmm. Karyn, coming back to you, obviously we don't know yet outright, you know, perhaps there's whisperings, but we don't really know who's going to be the first potential witness here. Take us through, you know, the STAR legal team, the evidence leaders here. Tell us who's Mpumelelo Madlanga.
Well, Mpumelelo Madlanga served as the acting Deputy Chief Justice for quite some time. He's regarded as a sort of legal luminary, and you know, he's given a variety of incredibly impressive judgments, which came out, you know, in the ceremonial sitting that was done for him. But he also has a very rich and varied history as both a legal practitioner and a prosecutor himself. And also in commissions of inquiry. So he has this extraordinary legal career where he becomes a judge very, very young, but then leaves the judiciary and goes back to practice as a senior counsel. And as part of that, he then is one of the main evidence leaders in the Marikana inquiry, which of course was an incredibly important investigation into that horrendous massacre that occurred, where he was really pushing the envelope in terms of, you know, exposing, you know, looking into these allegations and evidence of police attempted cover up and the false version of events that was created about what had happened there. So, you know, he is extraordinary, and he's you know, been around the world. He has, while a justice of the Constitutional Court, his judgments are very, very highly regarded. I mean, one of my favorite judgments that he gave was in regard to the JSC, the Judicial Service Commission, where they were trying to argue that their deliberations around appointment of judges, you know, potentially needed to be secret. And he said no. He said there needs to be transparency. You know, these kind of decisions have such far-ranging significance. We need to know what they're about. And so this is not a man who he's got a fundamental sense of moral integrity. He's got a fundamental desire to get to the truth. And he has, you know, a deep commitment to, you know, transparency in all its forms, including for the judiciary. And that's very, very important, because it's not just about the police, Graham. I mean, Lieutenant General Mkhabela is saying there's a far-ranging infiltration of the justice system. And he's even suggested that judges may themselves be involved, magistrates, prosecutors, the SSA. We haven't heard the evidence to substantiate that, and we don't know what he's going to produce to back that up. And of course, we see the MKP has already raised that in an argument and said, well, you know, you can't have judges potentially investigating judges, which is ironic because, of course, that's exactly what the Judicial Service Commission does. But, you know, in terms of a character, personality, and a person with a very respected history in our legal environment, he really is the right man for the job. But in many senses, and I've even said this to him, this is kind of a poison chalice to inherit, because you are really going into very, very difficult territory here. And no matter what, the findings are, what happens here, it's going to be a highly controversial process. And I'm not, I don't know if he is, in terms of the environment that he's in and the tools that he's been given, capable of getting the kind of accountability that South Africans crave. On a legal perspective, he isn't. It's going to be a political decision what is done with the evidence that he uncovers and the recommendations he made. But I mean, instead of going to Namibia and serving as an acting judge there, which was his original plan, he's now found himself thrust into, I think, one of the most potentially highly contentious inquiries that this many inquired country has ever had.
I just want to read one of our comments that we got from one of the News 24 cast of thousands. Spitfire SA just chiming in with a comment now. Delaying tactics, they claim, to get rid of evidence at this time. There's this huge problem at the moment in South Africa, and of course we've all dealt with it around the braai discussions, around the water cooler, if you will, the usual cliches of a very big perceived lack of accountability at the moment. A lot of people who perhaps may have switched their vote to the ANC for President Cyril Ramaphosa in his first term were hopeful that, finally, the time will come that perhaps more orange overalls will be doled out. Yeah, we're sitting at the stage now where the Zondo Commission sort of recommendations in many respects are gathering dust. You have former Chief Justice Raymond Zondo himself claiming he doesn't have an awful lot of confidence in the current state of the Hawks. Mpumelelo, your take on this. How do you think the president sort of handled everything thus far since that bombshell press conference with Mkhonazi?
Well, I think the president did well, first of all, to do something to try to get to the bottom of the allegations made by General Mkhonazi by immediately announcing a commission of inquiry and making the kind of a choice of Madlanga's caliber of a judge to chair that inquiry. I think that's the president did well there, although there've always been questions about what has he done with some of the recommendations that came from Zondo that touches on the security cluster, the intelligence, and what has it done with that July unrest panel that did the investigation and gave him a report indicating the politicization of intelligence and security structures. There are also question marks, about whether he has implemented the Falam Commission recommendations, which also touched on the structure of the police and how they can be held to account. There's also issues about whether we have learned anything at all about the fall of General Jackie Silebi because of the corrupt allegations, followed by Charles Patlane, who is also implicated, and he has to undergo some trial because of the corruption allegations that he was implicated. And then, of course, General Cele himself, before he became police minister, when he was a commissioner, there were allegations of corruption around the procurement of properties, but he was eventually cleared by a court when the matter went on review. But there were always suspicion about his handling of procurement issues. So there's a whole lot of things that somehow the government has not learned from. And as a consequence of that, in my view, some of the malfeasance had been building up. Some of it may be systemic. Some of it has to do with individuals just being unethical, just being corrupt. Some of it has got to do with the lack of deterrence and accountability within this security structure. So even as the president took the right decision to get to the bottom of the current allegations, there are also valid queries about, couldn't he have addressed some of these things by being proactively dealing with the recommendations that came before this bombshell of General Mkhonazi? And there's also been this type of tension within the security cluster. And it's not new. During the Thabo Mbeki's time, there was tension between the Scorpions and the SAPs and other divisions. And now we're seeing this type of tension occurring within SAPS itself. So you have a commissioner accusing the Minister of Police, and you have got the commissioner accusing the deputy commissioner of police, and it's a whole lot of and the IP at some point was implicated in trying to investigate Mkhwanazi, an investigation that subsequently was dropped. So there's a whole lot that is happening within the police that I think could have long been addressed. But of course, it has now exploded in the way it has done, and the president had no option but to do this type of inquiry. There will be value out of this inquiry if the president acts on the findings that come out of it. Because there's another thing about this inquiry is that there is no pressure or obligation on the part of the president to implement the recommendations coming from commissions of inquiries. Although they've got other value in terms of illuminating what the issues are and helping society understand what's going on, what is at play. But in the end, it's the president who should make sure that these things the recommendations are implemented. The other flip side is that some people who may be found to have done something wrong may want to delay the implementation of the recommendations because they can review this report or try to set it aside depending on what the findings are. So those are valuable avenues to delay, to stall, to obfuscate, can also render the whole exercise valueless. But let me make the last point on your question. The question raised by one of our viewers, it sounds like a very cynical question, but it raises something very fundamental that many South Africans are now worried about, that there is no trust, or should I say trust is diminishing. Public trust is diminishing in law enforcement agencies. That's why when there's something wrong, there's a delay, or they're trying to quash the evidence, they're trying to suppress something. It may not be true, but it just demonstrates the extent to which people no longer trust the system. So what this commission needs to do, it needs to flesh out all the rot. It needs to make very serious recommendations, and the recommendations must be followed through. And then there must be a process to build trust. Because without trust, if people don't trust the security cluster, they have no reason why they should report cases there. There's no reason why they should believe the NPA will prosecute. There's no reason why they should trust in the findings made by judges in our courts. So it incentivizes them to establish parallel structures of justice which are illegal, or to even undermine the existing structures of justice. So the importance of this commission cannot be understated.
Yeah, 100%, Mpumelelo. And if you're just tuning in, if you'd like to be part of the conversation, be sure to drop a comment on our YouTube live stream here, as well as if you've got a voice note at the top of your mind, send it to 072-562-3179, and that'll be played out in the lead later this evening. Yeah, to that point, and of course, there are success stories within the police. It's so easy to bash the police in some respects, but, here you have a case this week of a kidnapped 62-year-old Gqeberha woman, and she was very quickly reunited with her family. And, some activists talking about that particular case said the family had this renewed sort of faith in the police and thanked them for it. And there are these success stories, and we as the media need to echo them as well. Guy Lamb, just to bring you in the conversation, look, it is difficult to sort of say exactly what we want to get out of this commission, but I'm sure it's sort of hoped within, the general thinking that perhaps it'll, offer up a new plan to help arrest this perceived notion of a lack of accountability in South Africa today. What are you sort of expecting here on a policy front that might change the game?
Well, I think the most important thing really is around seeking clarity and having fairly robust oversight and monitoring systems of what happens within the SAPS in relation to corruption, and also in terms of corrupt relationships. And I mean, what's the problem we have at the moment is that, SAPS has its own internal disciplinary processes. And it doesn't seem to hold its members to account as effectively as we as members of a democracy, citizens of a democracy would expect. So, there's much greater degrees of accountability within other government departments when it comes to SAPS internal disciplinary processes often just result in a slap in the wrist, or you see certain members, getting away with certain problematic actions. And, the police don't really have to account to anyone. The point is we have a fairly kind of weak parliamentary oversight process when it comes to kind of police issues. Certainly the kind of components within Parliament, the Portfolio Committee on Police, haven't really been holding the police to account on these sort of issues. The acting police minister has indicated this is a key issue for him. So coming up with some sort of clarity, much more robust oversight processes that are in place, because at the moment the main oversight body that deals with police abuse, misuse of funds is IPID, but IPID tends to focus on the issues of sort of police use of force. So, where police kill people. And it's supposed to look at corruption, but it doesn't have enough resources to tackle it. Also, these are quite complex cases. So we really do need an overhaul of that particular system, because the reason why the SAPS is being, riddled and affected by this procurement corruption is because it is a massive government department with, stations across the country, more than 1,100 stations. It's got, the most number of employees. So there's a lot of money for procurement. So it makes it incredibly vulnerable to this. And of course, it has kind of complex systems in place. And the complex systems make it easy for those who understand them to manipulate them. And that's the kind of issue going forward. So we really need to be looking, number one, at procurement and the kind of provision of services, but then also needing to have proper oversight of how the police act, and to account in a much better way for the way in which they've been performing, especially when there have been problematic actions taking place.
Yeah, I want to bring Karyn in here. Karyn, help us out here with, in terms of the people, the advocates assisting the retired acting Deputy Chief Justice here to bring evidence, to bring the witnesses to the fore. Of course, many of them will now be sort of watched, listened to for a really long time, because I also expect this commission, as some sort of touted as an extension of Zondo, to be quite long. I think it's going to be quite long. It's going to be all-encompassing. It's going to be, take up weeks and months of our time. We're going to be having many more discussions like these. Do you think the terms of reference or the scope will change? And who are those very important advocates assisting the former justice?
Well, I mean, the terms of reference are extremely wide. I mean, the comparison with the Zondo inquiry is completely appropriate, because we know that when Thuli Madonsela made her report in the state of capture report, she wanted a very narrow 6-month investigation, very similar to what has been proposed with this, into these allegations of Jacob Zuma's relationship with the Gupta family, which he was not really addressing in her interview with him. And, this issue of ESCOM and et cetera, et cetera. So she wanted a very defined inquiry over 6 months, which would then have the legal power to subpoena, call witnesses, do what it needed to get to the truth of that. And of course, what happened was then President Jacob Zuma created very wide-ranging terms of reference that effectively said, investigate all corruption everywhere. And what emanated, of course, was that we effectively had this scenario when, instead of Jacob Zuma being put on trial, his ANC government was put on trial. And in a way that ended up being very, very damaging for it, not necessarily in terms of the orange overalls that people wanted, but I think there was a political consequence to it, because, of course, Jacob Zuma, who's one of the primarily implicated individuals in that process, goes to jail in the because he defies the constitutional court order to appear before it. Then forms his own party, and the ANC also loses significant amounts of its support. And I think there is an expectation that trend will continue. But in Zondo 1, you obviously had sort of people like Paul Pretorius, and a number of others, Kate Hofmeyer, there were very high profile names attached to that, which involved a kind of public accountability processes with, Yake Kwinana and others, that maybe on some level gave people the sense that at least someone was asking the questions that needed to be asked. We are seeing some of the names that appeared in Zondo appear in this inquiry. Of course, Matthew Chaskelson, the son of the late Chief Justice Arthur Chaskelson, is amongst the evidence leaders. Adila Hassan, she appeared, of course, in the ICJ as part of South Africa's genocide case against Israel. We know that Terry Harry Motau is the chief evidence leader, most well known for his excellent work in exposing the downfall of VBS Bank, with all the high level political implications of that for certain members of the ANC, and of course, most notably, the economic freedom fighters, the EFF. Ceci Baloy, who is one of the, the panel who is serving alongside, retired Deputy Chief Justice Madlanga, she is well known as one of the people who serves on the Judicial Service Commission, a very, prominent advocate, much respected. And it's a seriously, strong group of people with a great deal of advocate. Selo, of course, also served on the state capture inquiry. So we're talking about very, very serious people who I think grasp the import of the task ahead of them. And that is why, Graham, they have been so resolute about, we are doing this properly, and we are doing this in a way that is secure and doesn't compromise evidence, but certainly also does not allow that evidence to potentially be hacked and obtained by people who may have malicious purposes for it. Of course, we know our colleague Jeff Wicks, doing excellent work with his book on the murder of Babita Dekaran, exposes in great detail how whistleblowers are oftentimes, risk their careers, but are now risking their lives by coming forward. And so this is not a sort of, you overblown, it's an exaggeration. No, people have paid with their blood for doing this kind of work. And I think the inquiry is very, very aware that to not take that seriously, to not address Mkhwanazi's allegations there, though there may be an element or a strong element of truth to them, that needs to be tested, would be negligent for it. And that's why they are taking the stance that they are, and why they are not going to allow the urgency of this particular moment politically for all of us to drive them to compromise on a basic standard of security and safety that allows them to fulfill their requirement to protect witnesses and whistleblowers.
Excellently put, Karyn. I could not have said it better. While I have you on this particular moment, we just got a comment from one of our listeners and viewers at this time. Just asking what new deadlines have been announced for the commission. Any new start date? How long is the delay? I mean, we really don't know at this stage. There's we both,
and they've basically said, I mean, my understanding is that, and it comes through in the statement, right? They said, we said the 1st of September, based on the assurances of the Justice Department that no, everything's going to happen. They haven't said as much, but it was their laptops are going to come and we're going to make sure everything's secure. And so we came out publicly and we said, we've got this Bridget Mabandla building in Pretoria, and we are going to be able to proceed on the 1st. We're not going to commit to anything until such time as we have the stuff that we need. And, we've heard, so the minister very much pushed back against me saying, is there a breakdown in this of trust? Is the breakdown in the relationship? But it does look that there's going to be some fundamental repairs that need to be done for this process to move forward. And those repairs are essential because the Justice Department is responsible for the procurement going forward. And we still, Graham, have major questions, for instance, around the security around witnesses, given that the people you would normally go to, aka the NPA and the police, are themselves implicated. So what do you do in those scenarios? We still really don't know what's going to happen there either.
I want to go to political analyst Mpumelelo Mkhabela on our expert panel today. And you're welcome to respond to anything that Karyn just said there. But what do you make of this, MK Mkhotho Wesizwe Party attempts now in front of the courts to essentially challenge the establishment of this commission and all the orders, the executive orders that the president had made in regards to, putting, what do we call him? Acting police minister, no longer police minister, Senzo Mchunu on gardening leave, and then Feroz Kachalia coming in on an acting front. What do you take on this battle in the courts now? It's, as I understand it, due to be heard later in September.
Yeah, I'll come to that, but I want to tag along on what Karyn had just said, just to add that one of the consequences of this delay is that it compromises the president's undertaking to take swift action arising out of the findings of this Madlanga commission. The president undertook that he would need regular reports, 3 months report, and then he would not wait for the final report to take action. So depending on what the interim reports that will be coming up say, he will then act on them. Whether matters need to be referred to for criminal investigation or disciplinary hearings, those things can be acted on without waiting for Madlanga's commission to finally wrap up in the end. So the delay means it postpones whatever action the president would have potentially taken. So the shift is actually immense. So the president's undertaking to the public is compromised by this delay. I'm not therefore surprised that the Minister of Justice, Mpumelelo Mkhabela, has moved swiftly to try to discipline the officials. However, there will be question marks about her. What has she been doing behind the scenes together with the officials to make sure that the commission sits on time and the president's undertaking to the public is upheld? So she also must account what has she been doing. I think that's a big element for me. And the longer the delay, the more the president's undertaking to the public to act swiftly is compromised. And that, I think, should be understood by everybody. So coming to the issue of MK Party and them challenging the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry, I think it will be impossible for them to win an argument in court that the president has no power or the president can't establish an inquiry of this nature because judges can't investigate themselves. I mean, we have a system in this country where the Constitutional Court, which is a court of judges, is the ultimate authority on everything that has to do with disputes, the interpretation of the law, including even if those disputes involve the judges of the Constitutional Court themselves. South Africans, some of them who follow the court might remember that at some point, former Chief Justice Sandile Ngcobo was a subject of a court judgment by the Constitutional Court itself, and it ruled against him or against attempt to renew or extend his contract, his term as a Chief Justice. So the Court assembled and made a judgment, and they ruled unfavorable against their colleague. So you cannot run away from the fact that we are a society governed by the rules of the Constitution, or a constitutional democracy. So ultimately, whether you like it or not, Constitutional Court in the end, or judges generally in the end, will make a final determination on matters of disputes, interpretation of law, or conduct of public officials, be it the president or even judges themselves. So you can't run away. So they can't win that kind of argument. However, there is a political mileage they can get out of the argument around whether or not it's justifiable or reasonable or lawful or constitutional for the president to have 2 ministers of police, as we currently have. They can argue that there's nothing like that in the Constitution. So there's a bit of room for them to argue. If they can't win that argument legally, at least politically, it's an interesting argument. And a lot of people might be very sympathetic to that argument, that we currently the public's paying 2 salaries of 2 police ministers. And there is no saying, well, this one earns less because there's a permanent one. They are all having the same obligation in terms of the Constitution. They all attend cabinet. They've got full responsibility. There's no one who's lesser than the other. So there is an argument to be made there. And I personally will be very much interested to know how the court will rule around that, because it has never happened before.
Super fascinating. We're running a little bit out of time, and I want to give everybody their final word, and I want to get to this burning issue next, a very practical one with Dr. Guy Lamb, our criminologist and political scientist. Guy, there's a famous, I took a picture once of a protester out here in Cape Town, and he says, "I'll see you next week to protest against crime on the Cape Flats." As being an issue that never really goes away in terms of gang-related crime, high violence, particularly in the Western Cape. Yeah, we've seen the Democratic Alliance in their stronghold pushing for the longest time now for the devolution of policing powers in this particular province. There's even been a motion passed within the city of Cape Town recently in regards to this. It feels like recommendations around provinces governing the way that they institute the police could very well be at least a topic that's brought before this commission. What do you think?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean, the terms of reference of this particular commission are quite broad. I mean, it's looking at issues around corruption within the police, corrupt relationships with organized crime, kind of procurement, service provision issues. It's looking at this incredibly complex issue of, the political killings task team, which I think actually cuts to the core of why this commission exists in the first place, because this was probably the burning issue that drove Lieutenant General Mkhabela to make the statements he did, because this was his kind of unit, and it had been disbanded, and he was really upset about it and really angry about it. And that itself, there's a lot of complexities and different aspects to it. And so, of course, around moving, forward around this issue of what do we do with the police? How do we prevent corruption, political meddling within the police? There may very well be conversations about the devolution of power. Of course, this is something the Democratic Alliance has been advocating for many, many years. They used it in the last, in a number of elections, actually, around, this, if you vote us in, we will push for the devolution of policing powers. Within the Western Cape, they've been quite creative in finding ways for the provincial government to have some form of policing control. So they've used the city of Cape Town to employ these law enforcement, these special law enforcement officers. They have this safety plan. So they've done a lot of creative things. But what's also happening as well, which is positive, even now got now the suspended police minister, Minister Chunu, was quite instrumental in getting these cooperation agreements in place. So in the city of Cape Town, Western Cape Province, and national, that cooperative agreement is really starting to build momentum. So we're seeing kind of positive aspects there. Gauteng's been sort of flexing its muscles a bit, and this commission has a very strong Gauteng focus, if you look at it, because it also wants to look at Ekurhuleni, Tshwane, and City of Johannesburg, Metro Police as well. It's not looking at any of the other cities, it's just looking at those in addition to SAPS. And of course, this may very well be an issue within Gauteng as well, because, newspaper articles today about, Gauteng, criticism from the DA of, the Gauteng government that they haven't been able to conquer crime, combat crime effectively. So I think it may very well come up as well. And what is the potential of oversight? Because what the Western Cape government has done, which is a really interesting model, is they introduced a police ombudsman to investigate problematic actions by the police. And that came out of, you referenced the Khayelitsha Commission of Inquiry. That was a recommendation of that commission. They established it. And it's that office is very good, but it's restricted in what it can do. And if you can get a change to say, well, all provinces need to have ombudsmen and oversight mechanisms and places where members of the public can go to report, poor police service, corruption in the SAPS, engage with the SAPS in that way, because IPID, doesn't have the resources to deal with all those kind of issues. I think that could be a positive element.
Thank you so much. That's Dr. Guy Lamb, a criminologist, keen political scientist based out of Stellenbosch University. Thank you for that insight. And Mpumelelo, I just want to give you the final word here. We're sort of running out of time. Your final take on all of this, delays. We were all gearing up for Monday, 9 o'clock sharp in Pretoria for these proceedings to begin. Your final thoughts here.
Well, I think it's important that this commission sits as soon as possible. South Africans are very anxious to know the extent of the rot or lack thereof in the institutions that is responsible for maintaining law and order in the country, and for ensuring that everyone is equal before the law and that their safety is secured. And South Africans are looking forward to hearing whether there will be any solution to the kind of frustrations they are facing, feeling unsafe and watching this ructions within the police and all of that. So the sooner they sit, the better, so that we get clarity as a nation.
Absolutely. Karyn, you've got the final word, our specialist legal journalist here at News 24. I'm also championing the bit. Can't wait for this thing to get underway. From the purely perspective of who's going to be first to take the stand, we don't know outright, right? If it's going to be Mkhabela, we don't know that. They were only sort of, trying to glean from him certain information, et cetera, et cetera. Final thoughts?
I think that this commission is really, and we've made this argument in a piece that I did for News 24, it's the zenith of a bunch of commissions that were ultimately about, trying to disable effective law enforcement. We saw, again, just Judge Kampepe saying, don't disband the school The Scorpions were disbanded. Jinwala, don't fire Vusi Pikoli. Vusi Pikoli, the best NDPP there ever was, and I will die on that hill, was fired. The Marikana Commission, stringent action that should have been taken against high-level officials was not taken. And we have seen a fundamental undermining of law enforcement, which has been profoundly driven by the absolute antagonism that certain high-ranking leaders with the ANC, ironically, Jacob Zuma, most proponent of all of them, now criticizing Ramaphosa over the exact inquiry culture that he sought to benefit from with the whitewash arms deal investigation. We've seen this kind of culture of impunity and this fundamental antagonism to accountability that has seen our law enforcement environment dissolved, undermined, and destructed to the detriment of the South African public. And if this inquiry can give us answers about how that is remedied in a profound way so that South Africans can, as Mpumelelo has said, get that trust back in law enforcement, that's an absolute social essential. Because if it doesn't happen, Graham, we have people taking the law into their own hands, which has already started happening in different ways. But if that becomes a social norm, then that is fundamentally antithetical to rule of law, fundamentally antithetical to democracy, and fundamentally antithetical to the rights of all our citizens, no matter who they are.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to your keen analysis, Karyn. And of course, that breaking news X or tweet announcing the new date for the Madlanga Commission as soon as it's announced from the media team there. That's, of course, our star specialist legal journalist, Karyn Maughan. We also had political analyst, media columnist, as well as fellow author Mpumelelo Mkhabela on this very expert panel. And of course, political scientist, criminologist, Dr. Guy Lamb, Nkosi Kakhulu, Danko, Danki, Ngiyabonga, Kialaboa. Thanks to all of you for taking part in this discussion today. If you're listening in and perhaps missed this discussion, don't worry. The recording of which is going to be on YouTube in the next short while. We'll make sure that it lives up there. And of course, many of these sentiments echoed. I'll just be taking out the best bits for tonight's edition of The Lead, 7 o'clock sharp on all your various listening platforms, Iono, Spotify, YouTube, Apple, of course. So look out for that. Thank you so much. And if you'd like to leave any voice notes that will be echoed in that edition this evening, 072-562-3179 is the number, the WhatsApp number to drop those voice notes. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a fantastic weekend.